This is Chapter 46 of Following the Equator. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Following the Equator by Mark Twain, Chapter 46. The Thugs, Government Efforts to Exterminate Them, Choking a Victim, a Fakir Spared, Thief Strangled. If the desire to kill and the opportunity to kill came always together, who would escape hanging? Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar. On the train, 50 years ago, when I was a boy in the then remote and sparsely peopled Mississippi Valley, vague tales and rumors of a mysterious body of professional murderers came wandering in from a country which was constructively as far from us as the constellations blinking in space. India. Vague tales and rumors of a sect called Thugs, who waylaid travelers in lonely places and killed them for the contentment of a god whom they worshipped. Tales which everybody liked to listen to, and nobody believed, except with reservations. It was considered that the stories had gathered bulk on their travels. The matter died down, and a lull followed. Then Eugene Sue's Wandering Jew appeared, and made great talk for a while. One character in it was a chief of thugs, Feringhea, a mysterious and terrible Indian who was as slippery and sly as a serpent, and as deadly, and he stirred up the Thug interest once more. But it did not last. It presently died again, this time to stay dead. At first glance it seemed strange that this should have happened, but really it was not strange. On the contrary, it was natural. I mean on our side of the water. For the source whence the Thug tales mainly came was a government report, and without doubt was not republished in America. It was probably never even seen there. Government reports have no general circulation. They are distributed to the few, and are not always read by those few. I heard of this report for the first time a day or two ago, and borrowed it. It is full of fascinations, and it turns those dim, dark fairy tales of my boyhood days into realities. The report was made in 1839 by Major Sleeman of the Indian Service, and was printed in Calcutta in 1840. It is a clumsy, great, fat, poor sample of the printer's art, but good enough for a government printing office in that old day, and in that remote region, perhaps. To Major Sleeman was given the general superintendence of the giant task of ridding India of Thuggee, and he and his 17 assistants accomplished it. It was the Augean stables over again. Captain Vallancey, writing in a Madras journal in those old times, makes this remark: "The day that sees this far-spread evil eradicated from India and known only in name will greatly tend to immortalize British rule in the East." He did not overestimate the magnitude and difficulty of the work, nor the immensity of the credit which would justly be due to British rule in case it was accomplished. Thuggee became known to the British authorities in India about 1810, but its wide prevalence was not suspected. It was not regarded as a serious matter, and no systematic measures were taken for its suppression until about 1830. About that time Major Sleeman captured Eugene Sue's Thug chief, Feringhea, and got him to turn King's evidence. The revelations were so stupefying that Sleeman was not able to believe them. Sleeman thought he knew every criminal within his jurisdiction, and that the worst of them were merely thieves. But Feringhea told him that he was in reality living in the midst of a swarm of professional murderers, that they had been all about him for many years, and that they buried their dead close by. These seemed insane tales, but Feringhea said, "Come and see," and he took him to a grave and dug up 100 bodies, and told him all the circumstances of the killings, and named the thugs who had done the work. It was a staggering business. Sleeman captured some of these thugs and proceeded to examine them separately and with proper precautions against collusion, for he would not believe any Indian's unsupported word. The evidence gathered proved the truth of what Feringhea had said, and also revealed the fact that gangs of thugs were plying their trade all over India. The astonished government now took hold of Thuggee, and for 10 years made systematic and relentless war upon it, and finally destroyed it. Gang after gang was captured, tried, and punished. The thugs were harried and hunted from one end of India to the other. The government got all their secrets out of them, and also got the names of the members of the bands, and recorded them in a book, together with their birthplaces and places of residence. The Thugs were worshippers of Bhowanee, and to this god they sacrificed anybody that came handy. But they kept the dead man's things themselves, for the god cared for nothing but the corpse. Men were initiated into the sect with solemn ceremonies. Then they were taught how to strangle a person with the sacred choke-cloth, but were not allowed to perform officially with it until after long practice. No half-educated strangler could choke a man to death quickly enough to keep him from uttering a sound, a muffled scream, gurgle, gasp, moan, or something of the sort. But the expert's work was instantaneous. The cloth was whipped around the victim's neck, there was a sudden twist, and the head fell silently forward, the eyes starting from the sockets, and all was over. The Thug carefully guarded against resistance. It was usual to get the victims to sit down, for that was the handiest position for business. If the Thug had planned India itself, it could not have been more conveniently arranged for the needs of his occupation. There were no public conveyances, there were no conveyances for hire. The traveler went on foot or in a bullock cart or on a horse which he bought for the purpose. As soon as he was out of his own little state or principality, he was among strangers. Nobody knew him, nobody took note of him, and from that time his movements could no longer be traced. He did not stop in towns or villages, but camped outside of them and sent his servants in to buy provisions. There were no habitations between villages. Whenever he was between villages, he was an easy prey, particularly as he usually traveled by night to avoid the heat. He was always being overtaken by strangers who offered him the protection of their company, or asked for the protection of his, and these strangers were often thugs, as he presently found out to his cost. The landholders, the native police, the petty princes, the village officials, the customs officers were in many cases protectors and harborers of the thugs, and betrayed travelers to them for a share of the spoil. At first this condition of things made it next to impossible for the government to catch the marauders. They were spirited away by these watchful friends. All through a vast continent thus infested, helpless people of every caste and kind moved along the paths and trails in couples and groups silently by night, carrying the commerce of the country, treasure, jewels, money, and petty batches of silks, spices, and all manner of wares. It was a paradise for the Thug. When the autumn opened, the Thugs began to gather together by preconcert. Other people had to have interpreters at every turn, but not the Thugs. They could talk together, no matter how far apart they were born, for they had a language of their own, and they had secret signs by which they knew each other for Thugs, and they were always friends. Even their diversities of religion and caste were sunk in devotion to their calling, and the Moslem and the high caste and low caste Hindu were staunch and affectionate brothers in thuggery. When a gang had been assembled, they had religious worship, and waited for an omen. They had definite notions about the omens. The cries of certain animals were good omens, the cries of certain other creatures were bad omens. A bad omen would stop proceedings and send the men home. The sword and the strangling cloth were sacred emblems. The Thugs worshipped the sword at home before going out to the assembling place. The strangling cloth was worshipped at the place of assembly. The chiefs of most of the bands performed the religious ceremonies themselves, but the Kayets delegated them to certain official stranglers, chaurs. The rites of the Kayets were so holy that no one but a chaur was allowed to touch the vessels and other things used in them. Thug methods exhibit a curious mixture of caution and the absence of it, cold business calculation, and sudden unreflecting impulse. But there were two details which were constant, and not subject to caprice: patient persistence in following up the prey, and pitilessness when the time came to act. Caution was exhibited in the strength of the bands. They never felt comfortable and confident unless their strength exceeded that of any party of travelers they were likely to meet by 4 or 5-fold. Yet it was never their purpose to attack openly, but only when the victims were off their guard. When they got hold of a party of travelers, They often moved along in their company several days, using all manner of arts to win their friendship and get their confidence.